Okay, here's part two of topic 2.3. Last time we talked about how the slave trade affected those who were taken from Africa. Now we're going to look at how it affected those who were left behind. We will find that African societies, especially in the interior, were severely destabilized in the long term due to social problems stemming from the constant warfare and destruction of communities created by soaring European demand for enslaved people. We actually know something about the economics of this already. We know that starting in the 1500s, the European demand for slave labor skyrocketed due to the colonization of the Americas. And we know that a sudden, sharp increase in demand for anything leads to a rise in the price. We know that this will lead to an increase in supply as more sellers try to cash in on that big price tag. So, this created a monetary incentive for Africans to capture each other and sell their prisoners for personal profit. We also know that Europeans flooded African markets with guns, which made it easier for unscrupulous slave traders to acquire new prisoners. Looking at this map of Africa's many different ethnic groups, we can see the pattern play out geographically. We can divide African societies into two groups based on the way they were affected by the slave trade. The interior states were deep inside the African continent, which is what we call the interior, while the coastal states were on, well, the coast. The big slave markets were generally on the coast because that's where the Europeans were, and they were paying big money to pack their ships full of African captives. Remember that it's that sky high European demand for slaves to work on plantations in the Americas that drives the price up, and that creates the monetary incentive for Africans to sell each other into slavery. And remember that the Europeans also sold them guns. So, this situation naturally leads to an increase in violence and war, as local rulers had both the means and the motive to attack each other and sell prisoners. In particular, those states in the interior were increasingly raided and became the points of origin for the majority of Africans sold into slavery. As those captives were marched to the ocean, they passed through the coastal states, where rulers benefited from their control over the trade routes. Just as the Sudanic empires had grown wealthy by controlling the trans Saharan gold trade, many African coastal states now grew richer and more powerful due to their control over the supply lines of enslaved people. As always, history works in patterns, and control over a key trade route always increases a state's wealth and power. As for the interior states, things went less well. The increase in violent confrontations between ethnic groups and the presence of more deadly weapons made the African interior a far more dangerous place, and the constant threat of capture and enslavement had a destabilizing effect. We would do well to remember that slaves weren't taken from Africa. Mothers and fathers were taken. Farmers and workers were taken. Religious and community leaders, doctors and teachers, scholars and griots were taken. People who had important roles to play in their communities were ripped away from their people, never to be seen again. It was the catastrophe King Afonso had seen coming in 1526, but it was on a far greater scale, and it damaged African society to such an extent that it is still not fully recovered. The legacy of the slave trade in Africa is war, poverty, famine, loss of tradition, and ultimately collapse and colonization. The transatlantic slave trade, after 3.5 centuries of relentless human trafficking, had left Africa broken and brittle. By stealing its people, the slave trade had stolen its soul.